Hello everyone. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to set up our own API endpoints in our application. In other words, in our application so far, all authentication has relied upon cookies. However, what if a user is not in a web browser environment where the concept of cookies even exist? What if we want endpoints on our application to be available from any type of application, like an iOS native app, an Android native app, or any application that can send HTTP or JSON requests, not necessarily just web browsers? So in situations like that, instead of cookies, oftentimes applications will use tokens for their authentication. And luckily, Laravel makes that super easy to set up. Let me explain what we're going to do in this lesson. So we're not going to make our entire application and all of its functionality available through API endpoints, because that would be missing the point and that would be too time intensive. Instead, we're just going to set things up so that, assuming you've already registered for an account on our app, you are going to be able to use API endpoints to log in and receive a token, and then that token is going to give you permission to create a brand new blog post and also delete any of your existing blog posts. Now, the idea, though, is that this is not going to take place through a web browser. So right now, I encourage you to download either Insomnia REST or Postman. Essentially, these are non-web browser applications where you can practice sending programmatic or API requests. So they're both free to get started, or I know for sure Insomnia has a free plan. Postman used to be free. I believe it still is free, but lately they make it a bit harder on their website to just download it and get started for free. So my official recommendation is, instead of Postman, I like to use Insomnia REST. So if you just visit their official website and then, /download, you should be able to download for Windows, Mac, and even Linux. Okay, but just use the completely free plan. You don't need to spend even a single penny. You don't need to enter a credit card or anything like that. Just download it for free and then open up the application. The new application on your computer, when you open it up, should look something like this. The idea is that this just makes it really easy to send and test API requests, essentially just sending requests outside the context of a web browser. So, where do we begin? Let's set up an API endpoint. So back in our application, right, it would be like whatever your domain is. Because we're on our local development machine, our URL starts like this. But then after the :8000, imagine /API/login. So imagine we want to set it up so where you can send a post request to this URL and send along your username and password. And if you send along a correct, valid username and password, the application should give you back an access token. And then that token is what you use to prove that you are who you just said you were, right? So then you could send a post request to API/create post. And all you would need to send along is your personal access token, and then, the title of a new blog post and the body content for a new blog post. And that token should give you permission to actually do that. Or if you sent a delete request to API/post and then, the ID of the post, assuming you send along your valid access token, you should have permission to actually delete any of your posts. So that's what we're going to accomplish in this lesson. Let's start with the login URL. So how do we set this up? Well, we're going to set up a new route, so it's in our routes folder, but we're not going to jump into the typical usual web.php. Instead, I want you to open up the file in the routes folder that's called api.php. Down at the bottom of the file, there's an example route that's already set up for us. Right below that, let's just set up our own brand new route. So uppercase route, : we want to set up a pattern for when it's a post request, semicolon, and then we give it two things, right? The first thing we give it is the URL pattern. Let's just say, quotes /login. I should mention that any routes you define in your API file, they are sort of prepended with, /API. That can just be assumed. So you don't need to spell it out for each route. We're just going to spell out, /login. And then the second argument is the method, the controller method that you want to run. So just like always, we give it an array and then, user controller, : class, comma, And let's add a method to that controller named login API. There is nothing special about this name. I'm just making it up. Now, before we save this file, let's be sure to right-click on User Controller and click Import. Cool. We can save this file. And now let's go jump into our user controller. So, usercontroller.php. And it doesn't matter where, but maybe right above our original login function, I'm just going to create a brand new function. So public function, and we named it login API. So parentheses, curly brackets. In the parentheses, let's be sure to include uppercase request and then $request so that we can work with the incoming data, right? So the user, they hopefully sent along a username and password, and we want to check to see, were those valid? Before we even get to that, though, let's first validate that they actually included those fields, because if they didn't, then we don't even need to attempt to see, is it a match, right? Like if they didn't include anything for the username value, we can just immediately, exit this request. So we're just going to say, make up a variable name. Let's call it like incoming fields equals $request, call the validate method, give that an array. In the array, you would just have like username and set that to be required, comma. You would also have password and set that to be required. Now, after that, let's check to see, assuming that they provided values for username and password, that still doesn't prove that it was a real username with the correct matching password. So now that's what we would want to check. So I'd say if, parentheses, curly brackets, only if, and then I'm going to call the auth function for my condition check and look inside it for the method of attempt. In these parentheses, I would give it $incoming fields, right? That's going to give it an array with the username and password. Now, this will only return true if that is a valid username and password. So essentially, in this if block, that's where we would want to return with a personal access token. Otherwise, like below the if statement, you could just return like false or sorry, or any sort of message that's just not a personal access token. So you could literally just return a string of, like an empty string of text. However, assuming that they did provide a correct username and password, let's do this. Let's look up the user in the database. So $user equals, and then let's use our user model, so uppercase user, and it has a method of where. So : where, semicolon at the end of that line. And then in the parentheses for where, let's say where, username, comma, and then we would just provide the username we're looking for, which, lives on incoming fields. So $incoming fields, look inside that array for username. Cool. So assuming that the username they entered is a matching user account in our table, we now have an instance of a user model in this variable, $lowercase user. So now check this out. Below that line, we can say $, and we can just make up a name of anything. But let's say token equals, and now we can look inside that instance of a user, $user, and it has a method in Laravel of just create token. At the end of that, we would just look inside the object it's going to return for a property of plain text token, semicolon. In the parentheses for create token, we can give it a label. Let's just make up a label name of like our app token. Cool. And then finally, below that line, still in the if block, we would just return $token. Let's give this a save. And now to test it out, we would just go into our Insomnia REST application. In this left-hand sidebar, I would just create a new request. So this icon, HTTP request. If you want to, you can give it a name. Like if you double click on this, you can set the name to like, login test. But the idea is you would put the HTTP address right about here. First of all, let's set it to be a post request instead of a GET request. Okay, and then to save some typing, you can just go into your address bar, copy this into your clipboard so you don't have to type out, 127001. But essentially just paste that in, and then, at the end it would be /API/login. Now, what do we want to send along? For this body area, we just want to send along JSON. So under text, I'll click JSON, and now we just spell out a JSON object that has both a username and a password. So curly brackets for an object, and then quotes, username, colon, quotes, and then my username is Brad, comma, a property of password, colon, and then quotes, my value is QWERTY. So if I go ahead and send that over, actually let's fail it first on purpose. So if I get my password wrong on purpose and click send, we don't get a body response because remember we were just returning a blank string of text. So if you really wanted to, you could go into your login API function and just return like the word sorry if you wanted to, just to prove a point. So if I send that request again, cool, we see sorry. You'd probably want to return something that could be easily evaluated to false, just so that whoever's developing the application that uses these endpoints would have an easy time to determine if they got a token or not. But let's get this correct. So if I send my actual correct password, whoops, you can see we receive an error message, call to undefined method, create token. So there was something wrong with the way I'm calling create token. Yes. So we have an error on this line where we said $user. So at the end of that line, this where function, this is going to give you a collection, like multiple users where this is true, but we would just want the first actual instance, like the first item in the array that it's going to return. So at the very end of that line before the semicolon, you could just call a method of first, just like this. So look inside the object and then call first. Cool. That will get us the actual user instance, and then that should indeed have access to the method on the user model of create token. So let's save that and then just send the request one more time in Insomnia REST or Postman. Beautiful. So this value that it just gave me, this is my token. This token value proves that I am the user that just successfully, gave a correct username and password. So now we can send along further requests and we just include this token and we should get authorized, or we should have permission. Now what's beautiful about Laravel is that because we've already defined policies, remember when we learned about gates and permissions and policies, and we've already set up our user model file and our post model file, all of those permissions and all of those things that are interconnected, they still work even though we're approaching things from tokens instead of cookies and sessions. So this is super awesome. Check this out. Let's go into our API file and let's set up a route that lets logged in users create a new post programmatically. So right below this line, I would just say route : when you send a post request to quotes / and I'll just make it up like create -post, comma, give it an array, and then instead of our user controller, we'd probably want to have a method on our post controller, : class, comma, let's make up a method name on the controller of like store new post API. So I'm just making this up, store new post API, but let's save that. Actually, before we save that, at the very end of this line, but before the semicolon, let's use middleware to make sure that only logged in users can actually access this route and method. So before the semicolon, I would just say, dash greater than and call the middleware method. And for the value, I would just say quotes auth : sanctum. Sanctum is Laravel's official built-in API solution. And auth just implies, that you're authorized, that you're logged in. So this is not worrying about like gates or policies or specific permissions of like who can delete their own posts or who can update their own existing post. This is just saying as long as you're logged in and authenticated at all, then you should have permission. Right? And the sanctum here is just letting Laravel know like this is not cookie based, this is token based. Anyways, let's go ahead and save this, and now let's go set up this new method on the post controller of store new post API. So I would just go into my post controller.php, and we already have a function named store new post. I would actually just duplicate this function. So I'm just going to select from public function store new post down to the end of that function. Below it, just paste it in to duplicate it, and let's just change the name. So store new post API. And really, the only thing we would need to change is what we're returning. Because the only difference is we don't want to redirect to some sort of URL. Let's just give them back like the ID of the new post they just created. So you could literally just return like, a string of text that says congrats or something. But why don't we just return, $new post and look inside it for ID, semicolon. Let's give this a save, and now let's go test it out. So in Insomnia REST, I would just create a new route. So this icon, new HTTP request. You could actually double click on this to give it a name like, create new post. And instead of a GET request, we want it to be a POST request. To save some typing, I would copy the address, the URL for our website, paste that in, and then it's going to be /API. Don't forget the /API, /API/create-post. Now, for the body, we would want to give it JSON. So, a JSON object, and let's say title, like, my first post from the API, comma, let's give it, quotes, body, some body content. Let's just say lorem ipsum test. Cool. Now, if I try to send this without giving an access token, this will fail because we're not logged in. So if I click send, oops, well, it failed for a different reason because in the API routes file, I forgot to import post controller. Let's go back into our API file and just right click on post controller and click import class. And be sure to save that file. Let's try this again. So this request should fail because I did not paste in my access token. So if I click send, cool, the request does not go through, it just redirects me back to the home page. However, if we do provide our access token, so back in this login test tab, remember that response is our token. So I want you to just select everything in that response, just copy this token into your clipboard. And then back in this tab, where we're trying to send a request, to create a new blog post, here's what you do. Click on this auth option, and from the dropdown, choose bearer token. In the token field, just paste in your clipboard, and now this request should indeed go through. So if I click send, awesome, it gives me back an ID of 29 because I'm sure if you go check on our website in the browser, right? If I view the Brad profile, my first post from the API, and if you click on it, you can see it has an ID of 29. Awesome. Cool. So we just created an API route where only logged in users can create a post. Now let's set up an API route where you can delete a post, but remember it should use our policy where you can only delete your own posts that you're the author of.